The compass was broken. That was the first thing Noah Castellano noticed when he opened the wooden box his mother placed on the kitchen table 3 days after the funeral. The needle didn't point north. It didn't point anywhere. It swung in a lazy, purposeless arc behind the cracked glass face, catching the overhead light and throwing tiny reflections across the ceiling like a lighthouse that had lost its reason. "This is what he left you?" Noah's mother, Patricia, said it without malice. She said it the way you say something when you've spent 40 years being disappointed by someone, and the disappointment has worn itself smooth, like a stone in a riverbed, still hard, but no longer sharp. "Abuelito's compass," said Lucia. She was sitting across the table from Noah, her legs swinging because her feet didn't reach the floor, and she was looking at the compass the way she looked at everything, with the ferocious attention of a child who has been told nothing and therefore assumes everything is important. She was 7 years old. She had her grandfather's eyes. Everyone said so, though they said it carefully, because Abuelito's eyes had stopped working when Lucia was 2, and describing a 7-year-old's eyes as belonging to a blind man felt, to most people, like an incomplete compliment. Noah picked up the compass. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. Brass, old, the case engraved with initials he didn't recognize. R.A.C. The glass was cracked in a starburst pattern from the center, as though someone had pressed a thumb into it with great precision and deliberate force. The needle swung to approximately south-southwest and stopped, trembled, then swung again. It was not pointing at anything, or rather, it was not pointing at anything that existed on a standard magnetic axis. It was pointing at something else entirely. And what it was pointing at, in a root cellar beneath a farmhouse in the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri, was worth $110 million, built by hand, in total darkness, by a man who had not seen the sun in 15 years. Emilio Rafael Castellano lost his sight on a Tuesday in October. He was 53 years old, standing on a ladder in the machine shed of his property outside of Ava, Missouri, replacing a fluorescent light tube, when the ladder's left leg found a patch of hydraulic fluid on the concrete floor that Emilio had not seen, because the overhead light was the one he was replacing, and the shed was dim. The ladder went sideways. Emilio went down. His head struck the steel edge of a workbench on the way to the floor, and the world went out like a blown fuse. The medical term was cortical blindness, caused by traumatic brain injury to the occipital lobe. The doctors at Mercy Hospital in Springfield explained it with the gentleness of people who have delivered this kind of news before and know that there is no good way to do it, only less bad ways. The visual cortex had been damaged. The eyes themselves were fine. The wiring between the eyes and the brain was fine. But the part of the brain that turned electrical signals into images, the part that made seeing mean something, was broken, permanently. Emilio listened to the doctors with his hands flat on the hospital blanket. He did not cry. He did not argue. He asked 3 questions. Could it be fixed? No. Would it get worse? No. Could he still feel things with his hands? The doctor paused at this one, then said yes. His hands were unaffected. Emilio nodded. Then I can still build, he said. The doctor did not know what to make of this. Emilio Castellano had been a builder his entire life, not a contractor, not a developer, not a man who hired other men to do the work while he read blueprints in an air-conditioned trailer. A builder, the kind who dug foundations with his own hands and mixed mortar in a wheelbarrow and could cut a joint so tight you couldn't fit a piece of paper in it. He had learned from his father, Rafael Castellano, who had learned from his father, Arturo, who had built stone walls in Guanajuato, Mexico, before emigrating to Missouri in 1932 with a set of masonry tools and a conviction that the only honest work was work you could touch. The Castellano property in Ava was 40 acres of Ozark Hill country, rocky and steep, and covered in a mix of post oak and shortleaf pine. There was a farmhouse, white clapboard, built in 1947 by Raphael himself. There was a machine shed. There was a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the house, stone-lined, the kind of structure that Ozark families used to store potatoes and canned goods and occasionally shelter from tornadoes. And there was the land, which was beautiful in the way that the Ozarks are beautiful, which is to say stubbornly, without apology, a landscape that does not perform for visitors, but simply exists, ancient and limestone-ribbed and indifferent to opinion. Emilio had raised 2 children on that property. His son, Miguel, had left at 18 for Kansas City, become an electrician, married a woman named Patricia Reyes, and produced a grandson named Noah and a granddaughter named Lucia. Miguel was a good man who visited on holidays and called on Sundays, and who felt, in the way that sons of extraordinary fathers often feel, both proud and insufficient, as though his own competence was a lesser version of something he could never quite match. Emilio's daughter, Consuelo, had married a real estate agent named Darren Whitfield and moved to Branson, 40 miles south. Darren was the kind of man who wore cologne to a barbecue and who looked at the Castellano property not as a homestead, but as an asset class. He had suggested, on multiple occasions, that Emilio sell the 40 acres to a developer who was buying Ozark land for vacation rentals. Emilio had declined with the politeness that is indistinguishable from contempt. Darren had not noticed the difference. After the accident, everything changed. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a landscape changes when a river shifts course, the new path cutting deeper each season until the old one is just a dry scar in the earth. Emilio refused to leave the property. Patricia, who had driven down from Kansas City with Miguel to help, suggested an assisted living facility in Springfield. Emilio said no with such finality that Patricia understood it as an architectural fact, a load-bearing wall that would not be moved without bringing down the entire structure. Miguel, who knew his father, did not ask again. What happened next took 15 years, and no one who was alive to witness any part of it understood what they were witnessing until it was over. Emilio learned to navigate the property by touch and memory. This took 6 months, during which he fell 17 times, cut his hands on fencing wire twice, and walked into the machine shed door hard enough to give himself a black eye. He did not complain. He memorized. He counted steps. He built mental maps that were, in their own way, more precise than anything sighted navigation could produce, because they were 3-dimensional, incorporating not just distance and direction, but texture, temperature, incline, the sound of wind through different species of trees, the way the ground felt under his boots when he was near the creek versus near the house versus near the root cellar. The root cellar became his workshop. It had always been there, dug into the hillside 30 feet behind the farmhouse. Raphael had built it in 1948, the year after the house, using the same limestone that cropped out of every hillside in Douglas County. It was roughly 10 feet by 12, with a vaulted stone ceiling and a heavy wooden door and a packed earth floor. It stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter, which had made it perfect for storing preserves and which now made it perfect for something else. Emilio began expanding the root cellar 6 months after losing his sight. He told no one. He worked at night, not because he needed darkness. Darkness was now his permanent condition, but because the sounds carried less at night. Digging, chiseling, the scrape of stone against stone. He worked with hand tools because hand tools gave him feedback that power tools did not. He could feel the grain of the limestone through a chisel. He could feel the density of the earth through a shovel blade. He could feel when a joint was true by running his thumb along the seam, a technique his father had taught him when he was 9 years old and that he had never imagined would become his primary form of sight. He dug backward into the hillside, extending the cellar's footprint inch by inch, night by night, year by year. The limestone of the Ozarks is layered and fractured, which makes it both easier and more dangerous to excavate than solid rock. Emilio learned the stone. He learned its fault lines and its grain, the way a reader learns a language, by immersion and repetition. He braced as he went, using techniques he had developed through decades of building above ground and that he now adapted, by feel, for construction below it. In the first year, he extended the cellar by 8 feet. In the second year, 12 more. By the 5th year, the original 10 by 12 root cellar had become a 50-foot corridor with 2 branching chambers and a ventilation shaft that Emilio had drilled upward through 12 feet of earth and stone using a hand auger, working by touch, adjusting for drift by dropping a plumb line and feeling its position against the bore wall. The first stone he set blind took 4 hours. It was a piece of limestone roughly the size of a loaf of bread, and it needed to sit flush against the existing wall of the root cellar on a bed of packed earth that Emilio had leveled by dragging a straight edge back and forth until his fingers told him the surface was true. A sighted mason would have done it in 20 minutes. Emilio did it in 4 hours, and when he was finished, he sat on the floor of the cellar and pressed his palms flat against the stone and felt its position relative to its neighbors, and knew, with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of feeling how things fit, that it was right. It was perfectly right. The second stone took 3 hours. The 10th took 45 minutes. By the 100th, he had developed a method. He would rough dress each stone above ground during the day, sitting in the machine shed with a hammer and chisel, using his fingers as calipers, shaping the stone to approximate dimensions. Then, at night, he would carry it to the root cellar, sometimes 2 or 3 trips for larger pieces, and fit it into position, adjusting by feel, tapping with a rubber mallet, checking with his fingers, adjusting again. The process was slow in the way that tides are slow, invisible on the scale of hours, but transformative on the scale of years. He kept count. Every stone was numbered. He scratched the number into the bottom face of each one before setting it, using a carbide scriber, so that, if anyone ever disassembled the vault, they would know the order in which it was built and could, if they chose, rebuild it exactly. This was not vanity. This was the discipline of a builder who understood that craftsmanship is not just about the structure you create, but about the instructions you leave for the person who will maintain it after you're gone. By year 3, he had set 4,700 stones. By year 5, 11,000. By year 10, the vault was a complex of corridors and chambers that extended 80 feet into the hillside, with 2 branching rooms, a ventilation system, and a drainage channel that diverted groundwater around the structure through a gravel-filled trench he had dug and lined by hand. The trench alone took 14 months. He worked every night from approximately 9 p.m. to 2 a.m., 5 hours. He slept from 2 to 7. He ate breakfast. He sat on the porch during the day and listened to the property, to the birds and the wind and the creek, and he planned the next section of the vault in his mind, rotating 3-dimensional models behind his sightless eyes with a spatial intelligence that the blindness had not diminished, but had, if anything, sharpened, the way a musician's ear sharpens when they close their eyes to listen. The visiting nurse, a woman named Beth Carmichael, who came Tuesdays and Fridays, noticed the calluses on his hands and the limestone dust in his fingernails. She asked once what he was working on. "A project," Emilio said. Beth, who had been a nurse in rural Missouri for 23 years and who understood that old men on Ozark properties had projects the way rivers had currents, ongoing and private, did not ask again. No one knew. Miguel called every Sunday. "How are you doing, Papa?" "Fine, mijo. Are you eating?" "Yes. Do you need anything?" "No." The conversations were short because Emilio had never been a telephone person, and blindness had not changed this. Miguel visited twice a year, at Christmas and in August, and during these visits, Emilio moved through the house with the careful normalcy of a man performing the role of a blind person who has adjusted, which was true, but which concealed the deeper truth, which was that he had adjusted so thoroughly and so radically that the adjustment itself had become a secret life. Consuelo visited less. Darren visited never. They called on birthdays. They sent a ham at Christmas. This was the full extent of their engagement with a man they had decided was diminished, a word that Darren used once in a phone conversation with Miguel, and that Miguel, to his lasting regret, did not challenge. The compass was the key to everything. Emilio had been a collector before the accident, not of valuable things, not of art or coins or antiques. He collected tools, hand tools, vintage hand tools with wooden handles and steel heads that had been forged before the era of planned obsolescence, planes and chisels and spoke shaves and levels, and, among them, compasses, surveying compasses, pocket compasses, mariner's compasses. The one he left Noah, the brass one with the cracked glass, and the initials RAC had belonged to Rafael, Emilio's father. It was a surveying compass from the 1940s, and it had been modified. The modification was invisible unless you knew to look for it, and even then, you had to know what you were looking for, which was this. The compass needle had been demagnetized and remagnetized to point not at magnetic north, but at a specific bearing, 217 degrees southwest, the exact bearing from the front door of the farmhouse to the entrance of the root cellar. This was not accidental. This was Emilio's way of leaving a map for a grandson he could not see, using the only navigational instrument he trusted, the one his father had carried, the one that could not be lost in a filing cabinet or destroyed in a fire or intercepted by a son-in-law who wore cologne to barbecues. Noah Castellano was 26 years old. He was tall and thin, with dark curly hair that fell past his ears in a way that his mother called artistic, and his supervisor at the warehouse called a liability around conveyor belts. He had dark brown eyes, his grandfather's eyes, deep set and watchful, and he had the kind of face that resting made look sad, which was not inaccurate because Noah had been sad for most of the last 3 years, since his father Miguel had died of a heart attack at 51 while changing a breaker panel in a house in Overland Park, and since Elena had lost her sight at 7 and come to live with him, and since every plan Noah had ever made for his life had been quietly replaced by a different plan, the plan of just getting through. He worked at a distribution warehouse in Springfield, loading trucks on the night shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 4 nights a week. The pay was $16 an hour. The work was physical and repetitive, and it gave him the one thing he needed from a job, which was the ability to stop thinking for 8 hours. During the day, he took care of Lucia. Lucia was Miguel's daughter, Noah's half-sister, born when Miguel was 44, to a woman named Yolanda Torres, who had stayed long enough to deliver the baby and then left for Albuquerque with a guitar player she'd met online. Miguel had raised Lucia alone for 5 years before the heart attack, and then Noah had stepped in because there was no one else. Patricia had rheumatoid arthritis that made daily childcare impossible. Consuelo had offered to look into options, which meant nothing. Darren had suggested foster care, which meant less than nothing. The early months had been the hardest. Lucia, who was 5, and who had just lost the only parent she'd ever known, responded to grief the way some children do, not with sadness, but with fury. She threw things. She refused to eat. She screamed at bedtime and demanded her father, and did not understand why the man who had been there every morning was no longer there in any morning, and no explanation that a 23-year-old warehouse worker could offer was adequate because there is no adequate explanation for the disappearance of a parent. There is only presence, the willingness to sit in the room while the screaming happens and still be there when it stops. Noah sat. Night after night, he sat on the floor of the Springfield apartment with his back against Lucia's bedroom door and waited for the screaming to exhaust itself. Sometimes it took 20 minutes. Sometimes it took an hour. He did not enter the room uninvited because Patricia had told him, with the authority of a woman who had raised 2 children and buried a husband, that grief needs a door it can open and close on its own schedule. So Noah waited. And eventually the door would open, and Lucia would be standing there in her pajamas with Professor Carrots, and she would say, "I'm done being angry." And Noah would say, "Okay, you want some water?" And she would say yes, and they would sit in the kitchen and drink water at 11 o'clock at night and not talk about anything important, which was its own form of talking about the only thing that mattered, which was, "I am here. I am not leaving. The water is cold, and the glass is clean, and the world is still working, even though it feels like it isn't." By the time she was 6, the screaming had stopped. By 7, she was laughing again, the full-body, gap-toothed laughter of a child who has been reassembled from broken pieces by someone who did not know how to do it, but did it anyway, every day, without instructions, the way builders build, by starting with what's in front of them and trusting the structure to hold. So Noah, who was 23 at the time and who had been planning to enroll in community college to study drafting, had instead become the primary guardian of a 5-year-old girl with his grandfather's eyes and his father's stubbornness, and a stuffed rabbit named Professor Carrots, who accompanied her everywhere and who, she insisted, was fluent in Spanish. 3 years later, Noah was making it work. Barely. The apartment in Springfield was small, the shifts were long, and the math never quite balanced. But Lucia was fed, clothed, doing well in 2nd grade, and loved, and Noah had come to understand that love, in its most functional form, is not a feeling but a schedule, a relentless series of tasks performed without hesitation, because the person who depends on you does not care whether you are tired or broke or grieving. They care whether the cereal is in the bowl and the shoes are tied and someone is there when the lights go out. Emilio had died in his sleep, 83 years old, found by the visiting nurse who came twice a week, sitting in his armchair in the living room of the farmhouse, hands folded in his lap, face peaceful, as though he had simply finished a task and was waiting quietly for someone to tell him what came next. The will was simple. Consuelo received the farmhouse and the 40 acres, which Darren immediately began appraising for sale. Noah received the compass. Consuelo had called Patricia. He left the boy a compass? A broken compass? She sounded offended, as though the inadequacy of Noah's inheritance was a reflection on the family's collective worth. "Your father was a specific man," Patricia said. "If he left Noah a compass, there's a reason." There was. Noah drove to Ava on a Saturday, 3 weeks after the funeral. He brought Lucia because he always brought Lucia, because that was how their life worked. The drive from Springfield took an hour and 40 minutes through the Ozarks in December, which meant bare gray trees and cold fog in the hollows, and the particular beauty of a winter landscape that has given up pretending to be anything other than what it is. The farmhouse was empty. Consuelo and Darren had already removed Emilio's furniture, his clothes, his books. The walls were bare. The room smelled like pine sol and absence. Noah walked through the house with Lucia's hand in his and felt the specific anger of a man confronting the speed at which a life can be erased. He stood on the front porch with the compass. The needle was pointing 217 degrees southwest. He had checked it against his phone's compass app, and the reading was wrong, which meant either the compass was broken or it was pointing at something that wasn't magnetic north. "Where does the needle point?" Lucia asked. She was bundled in a red puffy coat with a faux fur hood, her dark curly hair sticking out in every direction, Professor Carrots dangling from one mitten. Noah sighted along the needle. 217 degrees from the front porch, through the backyard, past the machine shed, directly at the hillside behind the house, directly at the root cellar. Stay here, Mija. No. Lucia. Professor Carrots says no too. They went together. The root cellar door was heavy, rough-hewn oak, hung on iron strap hinges that Emilio had forged himself. It opened inward and downward, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. Noah turned on his phone flashlight. The steps went down 6 feet into what should have been a 10 by 12 room. Instead, the flashlight beam found a corridor. Stone-walled, stone-floored, stone-ceilinged, extending backward into the hillside farther than the light could reach. The stonework was immaculate. Each piece of limestone was hand-dressed and fitted without mortar, the joints so tight that Noah couldn't slip his fingernail between them. The walls were plumb, the ceiling was arched. The craftsmanship was, by any objective measure, extraordinary, and it had been done entirely by feel, by a man working alone, in complete darkness, for 15 years. Noah walked the corridor, 50 feet. At the end, it branched left and right. He went left first. The chamber was roughly 15 feet by 12, and along its walls, on shelves that Emilio had built from hand-planed walnut, were tools, hundreds of them. Vintage hand tools, each one restored, sharpened, oiled, and placed in a custom-fitted rack with a tag identifying the maker, the approximate date of manufacture, and the price Emilio had paid at the estate sale or flea market where he'd found it. The collection spanned 150 years of American toolmaking. Some of the pieces were exceptionally rare. Stanley planes from the 1870s, Diston saws with original etchwork, Miller's Falls braces with rosewood handles. Noah did not know what they were worth. He would learn later that the tool collection alone was appraised at $2.3 million. He went right. The second chamber was larger, roughly 20 by 15, and it was different. The shelves here held not tools, but documents. Filing boxes, archival quality, labeled in Braille that Emilio had taught himself after the accident. Inside the boxes, organized with obsessive care, were the following. Original land grant documents dating to 1847, establishing the Castellano family's ownership of not 40 acres, but 400, a discrepancy that had arisen from a surveying error in 1923 that had reduced the recorded acreage by 90%. The original grant, signed by the territorial governor, was unambiguous. The Castellano property extended from the North Fork of the White River to the ridgeline of Briar Creek Hill, encompassing 400 acres of Ozark timber and mineral land that had been quietly and incorrectly subdivided by Douglas County in the decades since the error. A geological survey, commissioned by Emilio through a firm in Rolla and paid for with cash over a period of 7 years, confirming that the 400-acre parcel contained significant deposits of high-grade barite and zinc, minerals used in drilling fluids and galvanization respectively, with an estimated extraction value of $90 million. The deed to the mineral rights, filed by Emilio through an attorney in West Plains named Samuel Okoye, placed in a blind trust with Noah Castellano as the sole beneficiary. Bearer bonds and gold coins acquired over 20 years, stored in a fireproof steel cabinet, valued at approximately $17.7 million. And a letter. The letter was in Braille on one side, and in Emilio's pre-blindness handwriting on the other, transcribed by Samuel Okoye from Emilio's Braille original. It read, Noah, I know you're reading this in the dark with a flashlight, and I know the girl is with you because she is a Castellano, and Castellanos do not wait outside. I built this for you, not for Consuelo. Consuelo married a man who sees land as money, and I will not give money to a man who does not understand what it buys. Not for Miguel. Miguel was my heart, but Miguel is gone, and I had to accept that the vault I built for him would belong to his son instead. This took me 15 years. I dug it with my hands. I shaped every stone by feel. Some days I set one stone. Some days I set none. I made mistakes that sighted men would not make, and I corrected them with patience that sighted men do not have, because patience is the only advantage of blindness, the understanding that you cannot rush what you cannot see. The compass was your great-grandfather's. I changed the needle. It points at 217 degrees from the front door. It will always point here. It is the only map that does not need eyes to follow. The land is yours. The minerals are yours. The tools are yours. Tell Samuel Okoye and he will handle the rest. Don't tell Darren. You know why. Take care of the girl. She has my eyes. I could not see them, but I could feel them watching me, and that was enough. Te quiero, mijo. Build something. Abuelo. Noah sat on the stone floor of his grandfather's vault and cried. Not the quiet, controlled kind of crying, the kind that comes from somewhere below the ribs and moves through the body like a wave, the kind that happens when something you didn't know you were carrying is suddenly and irrevocably set down. He cried for things he couldn't name and for things he could. He cried for his father, Miguel, who had died at 51 changing a breaker panel, a good man doing good work, who never knew what his own father had been building in the dark. He cried for his grandmother Rosa, who had died when Miguel was 19 and who had never seen this vault because it didn't exist yet, because Emilio hadn't started building until after the accident, which meant the vault was not just a storage space, but a response, a thing built in the aftermath of losing the ability to see the world, as though the loss had unlocked something, a need to create that was so powerful it could be sustained in total darkness for a decade and a half. He cried for himself. For the 3 years of warehouse shifts and cereal bowls and shoes, tied in the dark of early morning, the 3 years of being 26 and exhausted and responsible for a child he hadn't planned to raise and a life he hadn't planned to live. He cried because the compass had worked. His grandfather had modified a needle and trusted that his grandson, a man he had seen only a handful of times since the accident, would follow it. And Noah had followed it. Into the dark, down the steps, to this. Lucia, who had been quiet during the crying, which was unusual for a child who had opinions about everything, finally said, "Dad, can we come back tomorrow?" Noah looked at her. She was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor of the vault with Professor Carrots in her lap, and she was looking around the chamber with an expression that Noah recognized because it was the same expression he had seen in photographs of Emilio before the accident. The expression of a person standing inside something that was exactly right and knowing it. "Yeah, mija, we can come back tomorrow." They came back the next day, and the day after that, and every Saturday for the next 3 months, driving the hour and 40 minutes from Springfield to Ava, descending the stone steps into the amber light, and staying until Lucia fell asleep on the stone floor, using Professor Carrots as a pillow, at which point Noah would carry her up the steps and drive home through the dark Ozark Hills with the heater running and the radio off, and the compass in his jacket pocket pointing at something that was no longer behind him, but ahead. On the 4th visit, Noah brought a proper flashlight and explored the ventilation shaft. He found, carved into the stone at the very top of the shaft where no one would ever see it, a single word in letters that had been shaped by a blind man's chisel with excruciating care. Noah. He stared at it for a long time. Then he went back down and carved, below it, with the same chisel, Lucia. It took him 40 minutes. It would have taken Emilio 4 hours. The difference was sight, and the lesson was that sight was the least important part. Lucia sat next to him, She put Professor Carrots on his knee. "Professor Carrots says it's okay to cry in caves," she said. "This isn't a cave, mija. Abuelo built this." He built a cave? He built a vault, under the hill, with his hands, in the dark. Lucia considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old evaluating a claim that exceeded her current model of reality. Then she said, "That's the coolest thing anyone has ever done." Noah wiped his face. He looked at the corridor stretching behind them, at the immaculate stonework, at the shelves of tools and documents, and the evidence of a life that no one had known was being lived. 15 years, alone, in darkness, stone by stone. "Yeah, mija, it really is." The legal process took 11 months. Samuel Okoye, who had been Emilio's attorney for the last 12 years and who had helped file the mineral rights and establish the trust, connected Noah with a property attorney in Springfield named Diane Cardwell. Diane was 47, wore her hair in a severe bun, and had the particular energy of a lawyer who had been waiting her entire career for a case that mattered. The land grant discrepancy was confirmed within 60 days. The original 1847 document was authentic, verified by the Missouri State Archives and supported by independent historical surveys that showed the 1923 resurvey had been conducted by a county assessor who was, according to records Emilio had unearthed through Samuel Okoye, simultaneously employed by a timber company that stood to benefit from the acreage reduction. The 400 acres had been stolen by clerical fraud, and Emilio had spent 15 years in an underground vault assembling the proof. Consuelo and Darren found out on a Tuesday. They arrived at the farmhouse, which they now technically owned, to find Noah sitting on the porch steps with Lucia. Darren was driving the silver BMW that he'd leased after selling a spec house in Branson. He was wearing a quilted vest over a button-down shirt and shoes that were not designed for gravel, and he walked toward the porch with the stride of a man approaching a situation he expected to control. "Noah, we need to discuss this property situation." Darren's voice was the smooth, modulated instrument of a man who sold things for a living and who had not yet understood that this was not a sales call. "There's nothing to discuss," Noah said. "The mineral rights are in a trust. The land grant supports 400 acres. Diane Cardwell can walk you through the documents." 400 acres. Darren said it like he was tasting something unexpected. "The old man told me 40. The old man told you what he wanted you to hear." Consuelo stood behind Darren. She looked at Noah, and for a moment, her expression was not the expression of a woman defending her husband's position. It was the expression of a daughter who had spent 15 years visiting her blind father on holidays and never once asking what he did with his time. "He built something under the cellar," she asked quietly. "He built something extraordinary under the cellar. 15 years of work, stone corridors, archival rooms, all by hand, all in the dark. Why didn't he tell me?" Noah looked at his aunt. He looked at Darren, standing behind her in his quilted vest, already calculating. "I think you know why." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every Sunday phone call that Consuelo had cut short, every Christmas visit she'd skipped, every time she'd let Darren call Emilio, diminished, without correction. They left. Darren contested the trust through a Branson attorney. The challenge was dismissed in 4 months because Samuel Okoye had filed the documents with the same precision that Emilio had built the vault. Every notarization correct, every witness legitimate, every clause tested against the specific challenges that a man who had spent 15 years building in the dark had anticipated with the thoroughness of someone who had nothing to do while he worked, except think. The news moved through Douglas County with the measured pace of rural gossip, which is to say slowly enough to be digested, but quickly enough to be distorted. By spring, the story had acquired embellishments that ranged from the plausible, the vault was connected to a cave system, to the fantastical, Emilio had found Confederate gold, to the deeply Ozarkian. The vault was haunted by the ghost of Rafael Castellano, who had been seen by multiple witnesses holding a lantern, which was odd because Rafael had died in 1981 and had not, as far as anyone knew, been the lantern-holding type. The actual truth was remarkable enough without embellishment, and the people who had known Emilio processed it in ways that reflected who they were. Earl Stapleton, who owned the feed store in Ava and who had sold Emilio cement and lumber for 15 years, said, "I always thought he was fixing the cellar. 15 years of fixing a cellar seemed about right for a Castellano." Tommy Birch, the mail carrier who had delivered Emilio's packages for 2 decades, packages that he now understood had contained geological surveys, legal filings, and archival storage materials, said, "Best addressed packages in Douglas County. Never a wrong digit. I always figured he had someone helping him. He didn't have someone helping him." Tommy said this with the particular respect that Ozark people reserve for competence that exceeds reasonable expectation. At Ava Elementary, Lucia had become a minor celebrity, not because of the money, which the children did not fully understand, but because of the story. A second grader named Jacob Phelps told Lucia at recess that his dad said her grandpa was like a superhero, but underground. Lucia, who did not disagree with this characterization, but who felt it needed clarification, said, "He wasn't a superhero. He was a builder. Superheroes fly. Builders dig." Mrs. Halloran, the second-grade teacher, overheard this and later told Noah it was the most precise distinction anyone had made in her classroom in 22 years of teaching. The tool collection drew attention from historians and collectors. A man named Garrett Voss, who wrote for a national woodworking magazine and who had spent 30 years documenting surviving examples of 19th-century American hand tools, drove from Portland, Oregon, to see the collection. He spent 3 days in the left chamber of the vault, photographing each piece with white cotton gloves. He told Noah afterward that the collection was not just valuable, but historically significant, a curated record of American craftsmanship that spanned the Industrial Revolution. "Your grandfather wasn't collecting tools," Garrett said. "He was building an archive. He was saving the memory of how things used to be made." Noah did not move to Ava immediately. He finished the warehouse season because 37 people depended on the night crew functioning, and Noah did not leave people who depended on him, a principle he recognized, with a sharp ache, as his grandfather's. He used a portion of the mineral rights licensing, which Diane Cardwell negotiated with a consortium called Ozark Resource Group, at terms that made Samuel Okoye smile for the first time in Noah's experience, to pay off every debt he carried. Miguel's medical bills, the credit card that had paid for Emilio's funeral, the apartment deposit he'd borrowed from Patricia. He paid them all at the kitchen table in the Springfield apartment, writing checks with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that money is not wealth, money is the absence of fear, and the absence of fear is the first foundation on which anything real can be built. He established trusts, one for Lucia's education, structured to cover everything through graduate school, one for Patricia's medical care, one for Miguel's grave maintenance, because some debts are owed to the dead, and the dead do not send invoices, but the debt is real. He also called Consuelo. This surprised Patricia, who had assumed the legal contest had severed whatever remained of the family bond. But Noah understood something that Patricia did not. Consuelo was not Darren. Consuelo had been raised by Emilio. She had watched him build stone walls as a child. She had sat on the porch with him before the accident, listening to him explain why a particular joint was beautiful, why a particular stone had been placed at a particular angle, how the weight distributed through an arch, and why the arch was the most honest shape in architecture, because it could not exist without every piece supporting every other piece. Darren had eroded this. Darren had replaced Consuelo's understanding of her father with his own. the understanding that saw a blind man on a hillside and calculated depreciation rather than devotion. But the erosion was not permanent. Somewhere beneath the surface of the woman who had let Darren call her father diminished. The daughter who had loved watching her father build was still there, the way a spring is still there beneath a dry creek bed, waiting for the right season to surface. Consuelo came to see the vault in March. She came alone. Darren had moved to a Holiday Inn near Table Rock Lake after Consuelo had told him, with a quietness that was the Castellano version of detonation, that she needed space to think about what kind of person I've been. Noah led her through the corridors. She ran her hands along the stone walls. She stopped at a section where the joints were slightly wider than the rest, the section Emilio had built in the first year, when he was still learning, when each stone took hours instead of minutes. He was learning here, she said, touching the wider joints. This is where he figured it out. Yeah. 15 years. She pressed her forehead against the cool stone. I visited twice a year, 30 visits. I sat in his kitchen and drank his coffee and never once asked what he did at night. He didn't want you to ask. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to make you understand. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she was carrying one of Emilio's composition notebooks, the one from the first year, the one that began with a Braille entry that Samuel Okoye had translated. Today, I set 1 stone. It took 4 hours. Tomorrow, I will set another. He bought the farmhouse back from Consuelo, not because he needed to, Consuelo would have given it to him, but because Noah understood that transactions matter, that the exchange of value is how families acknowledge that what they're trading is real. Consuelo accepted the fair market price and used it to rent an apartment in Springfield, where she had enrolled in a counseling program at Missouri State, because, she told Noah, I spent 15 years not seeing what was right in front of me, and I'd like to learn how to help other people do better than I did. Darren was not part of this plan. Darren was in Branson, selling timeshares, which was the occupation that had been waiting for him his entire life, even though he hadn't known it. Noah repainted the farmhouse, white clapboard, the same color Raphael had painted it in 1947. He fixed the porch steps. He replaced the kitchen window that had been drafty for a decade. He did the work himself, using tools from the vault, and each repair felt like a conversation, not with Emilio, but with Raphael, the original builder, the man who had carried masonry tools from Guanajuato and built a house on an Ozark hillside that had stood for 77 years, and counting. Lucia started 3rd grade at Ava Elementary. She made a friend on the first day, a girl named Harper Boone who lived on the next property over and who owned a goat named Kevin. Lucia and Harper became inseparable. Professor Carrots and Kevin did not get along, but this was considered a manageable interspecies conflict. Noah began studying the tool collection. Each piece was a lesson in craftsmanship that his grandfather had assembled across decades and that now functioned as a curriculum. He started with the hand planes, learning to set the blade by feel the way Emilio had taught himself, closing his eyes, running his thumb along the edge, adjusting until the shaving came off in a continuous translucent ribbon. It was terrifying. It was meditative. It was a conversation with a man who could not speak back except through the objects he'd left behind. In the vault, Noah found a final chamber that he had missed on the first visit. It was behind a stone panel in the right-hand corridor, opened by pressing a specific stone that was marked in Braille, for the builder. Inside was a small room, maybe 8 by 6, and in it was a workbench. A new workbench, built from black walnut that Emilio had milled from a tree on the property, planed by hand to a surface so smooth it felt like water. The bench had a leg vise, a tail vise, tool racks, and a leather apron hanging on a wooden peg. On the bench was a single object, a compass. Not the broken brass one that had led Noah here. A new one, built by Emilio. The case was walnut, hand-turned on a lathe that Emilio had operated by feel. The needle was steel, magnetized properly this time, pointing true north. On the inside of the case lid, in braille and in hand-carved lettering that must have taken Emilio hours to produce by touch, were 3 words. Now, build yours. Noah stood in the hidden workshop, in the vault his blind grandfather had carved from an Ozark hillside over 15 years, alone, in darkness, stone by stone, and he understood that he was standing inside a love letter. Not the kind written on paper, the kind written in limestone and walnut and decades of patience, the kind that says, I could not see you, but I built this for you anyway. Because love does not require sight, it requires faith, and faith is just patience aimed at the future. He put on the leather apron. He picked up a chisel. He closed his eyes. He started the way his grandfather had started, with 1 stone, a piece of Ozark limestone, roughly the size of a dictionary, that he carried from the creek bed to the hidden workshop and placed on the bench. He studied it with his hands first, the way Emilio had taught him through the objects left behind. He felt the grain. He found the natural fracture lines. He picked up a chisel and began to shape it. The first piece he made was terrible. Lopsided, chipped, a shape that could charitably be described as organic, and honestly described as wrong. He set it on the shelf next to Emilio's precision-crafted compass, and it looked like a kindergartner's art project displayed next to a museum piece. He did not remove it. Emilio's first stone had been imperfect, too. The vault itself documented the learning, the wider joints of the early years narrowing as skill replaced ambition. The imperfection was part of the record. The second piece was slightly better. The 10th was recognizably a shaped stone. By the 30th, Noah was beginning to understand what his hands were telling him. The limestone spoke through the chisel the way a piano speaks through the keys, the tool and intermediary between the builder's intention and the material's nature, and the art was not in overpowering the stone, but in listening to what it wanted to become. He enrolled Lucia in the after-school program at Ava Elementary, so he could have afternoons in the workshop. He felt guilty about this until Lucia informed him that the after-school program had a hamster named Sir Reginald, and that she and Harper were basically running the place, a claim that her teacher, Mrs. Halloran, confirmed with the weary accuracy of a woman who had watched Lucia Castellano organize the art supply cabinet by color, medium, and frequency of use within 2 weeks of enrollment. On weekends, they worked together. Lucia drew at a small desk Noah had set up in the corridor while Noah shaped stones. She drew the vault. She drew the tools. She drew Professor Carrots exploring the corridors with a tiny headlamp. She drew Emilio from photographs standing in the workshop with his hands on a stone, and she always drew his eyes open, even though they hadn't worked, because, she said, his hands were his eyes, so his real eyes could do whatever they wanted. Noah framed this drawing. It hung in the workshop next to Emilio's compass and Noah's first terrible stone, and a photograph of Miguel at a job site, grinning, holding a pair of wire strippers. 3 generations of builders, each one connected to the next by the things they made with their hands. On a Saturday in November, 1 year after Emilio's death, Noah and Lucia drove to the property. They walked past the farmhouse, past the machine shed, down the path to the root cellar. Lucia was carrying a drawing she'd made at school, a picture of a hillside with a hidden door in it, and a man standing inside surrounded by shelves of tools, and above the hillside a sun with a face that was smiling, and next to the man, in green crayon, a small girl holding a rabbit. "That's you and me in Abuelo's cave," she said, holding it up. "Vault, mija. It's a vault. Professor Carrots calls it a cave." Professor Carrots doesn't have a degree in architecture. He has a degree in being right. They taped the drawing to the wall of the hidden workshop, next to the workbench, next to the leather apron, next to the compass that said, "Now build yours." The tape was purple, because Lucia chose the tape, and purple was the color of things that mattered. Noah Castellano started with a broken compass and a warehouse paycheck. What he found wasn't just mineral rights and tool collections and $110 million. It was a grandfather's 15-year answer to the question that every blind man asks in the dark: can I still build? The answer was carved into the stone of an Ozark hillside, fitted without mortar, shaped by hands that could not see what they were making, but knew, with the certainty that only builders know, that what they were making was true. Emilio Castellano came to this country's most forgotten corner with a set of his father's tools and went blind at 53, and spent the next 15 years proving that sight is not a requirement for vision. The vault he built is still there, beneath the hill, perfectly level, perfectly plumb, every stone fitted by touch, every joint true. The engineers who eventually examined it said it was among the finest examples of hand-dressed stonework they had ever seen. When they learned it had been built by a blind man, working alone, in the dark, they said nothing for a very long time. If this story moved you, if it changed how you think about the people in your life who keep working when nobody's watching, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, what would you build if nobody could see you building it? We read every single one. See you in the next one.